The mist rolled off the water like a breath held too long. At dawn, it clung to the shoreline, veiling the sleepy town of Rockport, Massachusetts, in a soft, gray silence. The hum of the ocean, distant and muted, met the quiet rattle of the highway as a lone worker trudged along Route 127. His boots made soft prints in the wet earth, the fog swallowing the distant hills. His job was simple today: clear the road, keep the salt marsh in view for debris from the previous night's storm. But then, something caught his eye, a small glint, half hidden beneath the cattails at the marsh's edge. At first, he thought it was nothing, just another piece of trash blown by the wind. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something more: a weathered leather purse, its edges frayed, the buckle rusted, buried halfway in the muck. The worker crouched down, his hands trembling slightly. The purse was old, too old to have just been left there. A stray breeze stirred the fog, and he carefully opened it, almost hesitant to disturb whatever secrets it held. Inside, a faded Boston University ID, the name Claire Donovan printed on the front. There was a Polaroid photo of a young woman, smiling, holding a coffee cup, her eyes bright with life, clasped between a stack of wrinkled papers. And then, a rusted key, the metal worn with age, labeled simply, North Star. His breath caught in his throat. Claire Donovan. The name echoed through his mind. A missing person from 1973. He remembered the faded newspaper clippings, the lines drawn under the case number. The quiet suspicion that had hung in the air for decades. Could this be her? Could the fog have kept the answer hidden all this time? His radio crackled, slicing through the thick silence. Detective Keller. A voice called, its urgency muffled by static. We just got a call. A tip from a payphone. They said to check the marsh before sunrise. Something about the name North Star. Tom Keller, new to the state police, stood at the edge of the marsh, still holding the purse. The weight of it felt like the air itself pressing against his chest, suffocating. His heart beat in time with the waves lapping at the shore. The name North Star. It pulled at something in him, a nagging sense of connection he couldn't yet explain. Keller looked toward the water, its surface dark and endless, stretching toward a horizon lost in fog. His fingers brushed over Claire's ID, now stained with the damp earth. "Where did you go, Claire?" he whispered softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "What did you leave behind?" The radio crackled again, snapping him back to the present. "Detective, you need to hear this," the voice on the other end urged, the words sharp and full of urgency. "They said, check the marsh before sunrise. It's about Claire." Keller's grip tightened on the leather purse. He could feel the weight of history pressing in on him. Decades of unanswered questions, of voices lost to the fog. The search for Claire Donovan had never really ended. Not for her family, not for the town. And now, it seemed, it was about to begin again. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far this story reaches. And if you're hooked, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Spring in Rockport, 1973, had a certain stillness to it, the kind that let the world breathe slowly, at its own pace. The town was dotted with weathered shops and narrow streets that stretched to meet the sea, and every few yards, the salty breeze carried whispers of history. If you spent enough time there, you began to feel like part of the landscape, like the rocks on Halibut Point or the sweeping curves of the shoreline. Claire Donovan, a 21-year-old art student, was one of those who never quite belonged to the town, yet had somehow become its beating heart. She lived in a small studio above Jerry's Bakery, a quaint little shop known for its cinnamon rolls and warm coffee. The smell of fresh bread always lingered, an odd comfort that tied Claire's creative world to the scent of something constant and enduring. The space was simple, just a desk cluttered with paint tubes, brushes, and a few unfinished canvases. But to Claire, it was everything. She had come to Rockport 2 years ago with nothing but a few dollars and a dream of becoming a renowned artist. The town was the perfect muse, its foggy mornings, the muted colors of its crumbling wharfs, and the endless stretch of the harbor had all sparked something inside her. Claire had a way of seeing things no one else could. While the tourists flocked to the picturesque views of the town, Claire painted its hidden corners, the cracked windows of old shacks, the fishermen's rusty nets, the tides that pulled at the bones of forgotten docks. To the locals, she was the girl who saw beauty in broken things, and they adored her for it. Claire worked at Mariner's Diner, a cozy spot where she waited tables, serving coffee to weary fishermen and tourists, their faces flushed from the brisk sea air. Her smile was warm, genuine, and she made everyone feel at ease. But beneath the surface, there was always an unspoken hunger. She was saving every penny for graduation, hoping to continue her studies at the Massachusetts College of Art in Boston. The dream was within reach, but just barely. The tips she earned at the diner were enough to cover the bare essentials: paint supplies, rent, and a few extra books. One late afternoon, Claire closed her sketchbook after working on her latest piece, an abstract painting of the fog rolling over the harbor. She stood up, stretching her arms above her head, and glanced at the clock on the wall. June 8th, a Friday, a day like any other. Her roommate, Kathy, was sprawled on the couch, flipping through a magazine. "You off to meet that guy again?" Kathy teased with a wink, referring to Mike Harper, Claire's boyfriend, who was a local fisherman. Claire rolled her eyes, a playful smile crossing her face. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, grabbing her scarf from the hook by the door. "I'll be back by 10. I promise." Mike had been persistent in his courtship, but Claire was never sure about him. They had been dating on and off for a while, but the spark she sought was always missing. He seemed like a safe choice, a steady man with a steady job. But in Claire's world, stability didn't always win out over ambition. The wind had picked up as she left the bakery, the tang of the sea filling the air. Across the street, a blue Chevy Nova idled near the curb. The driver, a man she recognized from the docks, waved. He wasn't anyone Claire knew well, just another face in the crowd of locals. But something about his smile seemed different that evening. Something magnetic, maybe too insistent. He leaned forward, his arm resting on the car door. Claire hesitated for a moment, then crossed the street. "Heading to the party, Claire?" the man called out with a grin. "Just for a bit," she replied. "I'll be back soon, don't worry." The sound of the Nova's engine sputtered to life, the wheels kicking up gravel as they pulled away from the curb. That was the last time Claire was seen. By the time Kathy turned off the TV at 10:30 p.m., there was still no sign of Claire. The house felt quieter than usual. At first, Kathy shrugged it off, assuming Claire had stayed out later than expected. But when midnight came and went, her concern grew. She picked up Claire's phone and dialed Mike's number. No answer. Frustrated, Kathy finally sat down at the small kitchen table, grabbing a scrap of paper from the counter. She wrote a short note, just the kind of message Claire would leave. North Star. Kathy stared at the note for a moment, confusion knitting her brow. She didn't understand what it meant, but she knew Claire wouldn't have written it if it weren't important. The night stretched on, and still, no word from Claire. Later that evening, a payphone booth down the street in a desolate corner of Rockport buzzed to life. The wind howled as the phone's receiver lifted in the shadows. A woman's trembling voice, barely audible, whispered into the receiver. "Check the marsh before sunrise." And then, the line went dead. What did the caller know? And why did she only say, "Check the marsh before sunrise"? What had happened to Claire Donovan in the hours before she vanished? The town of Rockport had its secrets, but the answers, if they existed, were still hidden beneath the surface. The days after Claire Donovan's disappearance felt like a slow burn, each one stretching longer than the last. Detective Tom Keller, newly assigned to Rockport State Police Force, was the first to take the lead on Claire's case. The town's air was thick with worry. By the time he had the initial report in his hands, the marsh had become the focal point of the investigation. There, along the sharp edges of the shoreline, Keller could already hear the town whispering. Volunteers gathered in droves, walking the edges of Route 127, combing through the thick woods, their footsteps heavy in the stillness. Helicopters cut through the fog, their blades a constant hum, sweeping the shoreline with a desperate grace. No one could say where Claire had gone, but everyone had their own theory. Some said she'd run away. Some said she'd been a victim of a jealous lover. The hardest rumor to swallow was the one suggesting that she had simply gone mad. A girl who had finally cracked under the pressure of ambition, disappearing into her own mind. But none of it made sense to Keller. Claire Donovan wasn't the kind of person who vanished without a trace. There had to be something else. There had to be a reason. Keller had driven the familiar roads over and over, his car becoming a constant presence in the town. He spent hours staring at the reeds by the marsh, searching for answers. Every week, he made the drive, the wind tossing his coat as he walked along the same path. His mind swirled with possibilities. What did that call mean? Check the marsh before sunrise. The words echoed through his mind like a broken record, gnawing at him. There was something there, something hidden beneath the surface. 3 names floated to the top of the list. The first was Mike Harper, Claire's on-again, off-again boyfriend. A local fisherman, Mike had the kind of rugged charm that could pull in a crowd, but his relationship with Claire had always been rocky. They'd broken up and gotten back together more times than Keller could count. When Keller tracked him down, Mike's alibi seemed solid. He had been in Boston for a fishing competition the night Claire disappeared. But something about the story didn't sit right with Keller. Mike had been too quick to confirm his whereabouts, as if he were too eager to close the book on the investigation before it even started. Then there was Eddie Colburn, a local handyman with a reputation for losing his temper. Keller had heard the rumors about Eddie. Quick to anger, always too eager to get involved in the business of others. He had a strange obsession with the quiet beauty of Rockport, always around, fixing something, but never really contributing to the community. When Keller asked around, people spoke of his strange behavior around Claire, how he would often hover near the diner, watching her with a look that was more than friendly. His hands shook when Keller spoke to him, but his alibi was airtight. He'd been fixing a roof at the local church. Still, Keller couldn't shake the feeling that Eddie had more to hide than he was letting on. The third suspect was Samuel Whitman, the man who owned the blue Chevy Nova that Claire had been seen getting into. Samuel was a pillar of the community, quiet, well-liked, a bit of a loner. But when Keller spoke to him, he was unfazed by the questions, almost too calm. Whitman claimed he'd been at home the night Claire disappeared, watching television alone. But Keller's gut told him otherwise. There was a coldness in Samuel's eyes that spoke volumes. He had no ties to Claire beyond the brief encounter in the car, yet there was something about the way he had acted that night, something subtle that Keller couldn't ignore. Days passed, and with each passing moment, the fog deepened, both literally and figuratively. No new leads emerged. The tips trickled in, some from well-meaning neighbors, others from people with too much time on their hands, but each one faded like mist over the water. There was a sense of stasis, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for an answer that refused to come. Keller found himself driving back to the marsh each week, looking for something, anything. His hands would grip the wheel tighter as he neared the familiar spot, the air growing colder with every mile. There was a deep ache in his chest, something pulling him back to that place. The case was his responsibility, but it had become something more, something personal. He knew he couldn't give up, not until he knew what had happened to Claire. Then, one afternoon, it happened. Keller was walking along the edge of the marsh when something caught his eye, a piece of fabric lodged in the tied fence, caught between the rusted metal and the reeds. His heart quickened as he bent down, his fingers brushing against the fabric. It was a fragment of Claire's scarf, torn and frayed, the color barely visible beneath the mud. The sight of it brought a sudden rush of hope, followed by an equal wave of frustration. He knew what this meant. It was another sign that Claire hadn't just disappeared on her own. Someone had taken her. Someone had led her into the mist, and now, the clues were starting to surface like forgotten memories. But there was no DNA testing yet, not in 1973. No easy answers, no immediate breakthrough. Just a fragment of cloth, an unanswered question, and a town caught in the grip of uncertainty. Keller stood there for a moment, staring at the fabric, the waves crashing softly against the shore. The silence was thick. But then, in the distance, the faintest sound reached his ears, the hum of a radio, the crackle of static. His heart skipped. "Detective," the voice on the other end said, "we found something. It's Claire's purse. It's been out there all this time." The fog thickened, the air heavier with each breath, and Keller's mind raced. The case was far from over. The years passed in Rockport like an endless tide, pulling everything toward the horizon and leaving behind only fragments of what once was. The case of Claire Donovan became another chapter in the town's collective history, slowly fading into the background, where the present went on living. The once busy Mariner's Diner, where Claire had worked, had closed down years ago. In its place stood an antique shop, the smell of dust and old wood wafting out each time the door opened. The counter where Claire had wiped down coffee cups sat empty, the stools no longer occupied by the quiet faces of fishermen and tourists. The jukebox was gone, replaced by shelves of faded china and silverware that looked as though they had been frozen in time. Rockport's pulse continued, but the diner's heartbeat had stopped with Claire's disappearance. Detective Tom Keller had long since retired, his badge now gathering dust in a drawer at home. He still lived in the same modest house, tucked between the jagged cliffs and the sea, but there was nothing for him there except the silence of memories. The Donovan file sat on his desk, its yellowed edges curled and fragile. He had marked the case with a heavy pen, the word unsolved still stamped on the cover, a weight he never managed to shake. His days had grown quieter over the years. The search for answers had long since become a forgotten fight, buried under the pressures of life, time, and regret. Yet every now and then, Keller would find himself pulling that old case file from the drawer, leafing through the worn pages, feeling the weight of the past. The faces of Claire's family, now grown faint in his memory, stared back at him in photographs. Claire's mother had died years ago, her passing marked only by a small obituary in the local paper, devoted mother of Claire Donovan, gone too soon without closure. No answers, no peace. Outside, the seasons shifted like clockwork. Snow fell softly in winter. Spring bloomed in quiet bursts. And every so often, when the wind howled through the trees, Keller would hear the faint echo of something he couldn't place. The case never left him, never fully let go. Even in his retirement, he couldn't walk away from it. But time had taken its toll. The file collected dust. The town moved on. A montage of fading newspaper headlines flickered in Keller's mind, as if the words themselves had become ghostly remnants of a past that still lingered. Young woman vanishes. Art student missing. No leads in Donovan case. Detective Keller. I'll never stop looking. The names, the faces, the years, they all blurred together. But it didn't matter. No one seemed to remember, except for Keller. And even he wondered if the case had become just another part of his own fading memory. The years had passed, and with them, the questions had softened like distant echoes. But even though time had obscured the truth, something had never been forgotten. Keller stood in his office one late afternoon, the low hum of the ticking clock on the wall mixing with the sound of the rain hitting the window. It was a stormy evening, and the ink on his old case files blurred beneath the drops of water that streaked down the glass. He stared at the file in front of him, lost in thought. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the roof. He stood motionless, the silence in the room thick with memories. And then, without warning, something shifted. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking the stillness. Keller picked it up on the second ring, his voice gruff from years of disuse. Detective Keller? The voice on the other end was unfamiliar. This is Mia Keller. Tom, it's me, your daughter. I found something about the Donovan case. He froze. The room seemed to darken for a moment. His heart skipped. Claire Donovan? He repeated. Yes, Mia said softly. I think it's time we finished this. As the rain poured outside, the wind carrying it against the window pane, Keller's eyes moved slowly over the yellowed file one last time. He whispered under his breath, as if to the case itself, but one small piece of evidence never forgot. And with that, the story that had remained locked away in time was about to resurface. How many of you have had a case or mystery that just won't let go, no matter how much time has passed? Share your experiences in the comments. And if you're enjoying this journey, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. The hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound in the sterile, quiet room. Detective Mia Keller sat at her new desk in the Boston Cold Case Unit, the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Her father, Tom Keller, had spent years on the Claire Donovan case, only to see it slip through his fingers like sand. Now it was her turn. She had inherited the case, not just the file, but the ghost that lingered with it. Mia shuffled through boxes filled with old case files, each one yellowed with age, some so faded the ink had almost disappeared. She paused on the Donovan file, which was marked with a stark, unsolved, in bold, faded red letters. Her hands hesitated for a moment, her mind racing through the fragmented stories her father had told her. The name Claire Donovan still echoed in their small kitchen, still wrapped in mystery. It had never sat right with Mia that the case had gone cold. She understood the pain of unanswered questions all too well, having seen her father struggle with it for years. With a deep breath, she opened the file, each paper inside crackling with the weight of time. She scanned the notes, photographs, and witness statements. Nothing new, nothing that would push her forward. But then, she spotted something out of place. A sealed envelope, tucked between two old case reports. It was addressed to Claire's mother, but the handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper discolored with age. Mia's heart skipped a beat. What was this? A letter that had never been mailed? Her fingers trembled as she carefully removed the envelope from the file, the edges curled with age. The seal was old, cracked, but still intact. She glanced over at the lab techs, who were busy with their own tasks, unaware of her discovery. Mia carefully pried open the envelope, the wax breaking with a faint, almost sorrowful sound. Inside, she found a half-page note, its contents unfinished. The ink was faint, but legible. Claire, the truth is closer than you think. I never meant for it to. The note trailed off, as though the writer had been interrupted or had run out of time. Her mind raced. Who had written this? And why had it never been sent? Mia's fingers brushed over the paper, the weight of the unspoken words heavy in the air. But something else caught her attention. The faint residue on the envelope seal, a smear of something glossy, saliva. A DNA sample. This was no ordinary letter. Mia turned to one of the lab techs. Can we run a DNA test on this? She asked, holding up the letter. Absolutely. The tech responded, already preparing the equipment. He carefully took the envelope from Mia's hands and began the process of extracting the sample from the seal. The lab was quiet now, the tension palpable as the team worked, the sterile environment amplifying the sound of each click, each movement. Minutes felt like hours. Mia stood by the computer, watching as the data slowly processed. The screen flickered, and then, nothing. Her breath hitched. No match found. The words flashed across the screen in stark, cold letters. Mia's stomach dropped. Another dead end. Her mind raced. She had hoped, no, needed, this to be the breakthrough they needed. But the lack of a match was, at best, a bitter confirmation that they were still no closer to the truth. But just as she was about to turn away, the screen flickered again. A second line appeared, slowly, deliberately. Familial connection detected. Whitman lineage, Essex County. Mia's breath caught in her throat. The Whitman name, David Whitman, the local pastor, a man who had been near the center of the investigation all those years ago. His father, Samuel Whitman, had owned the blue Chevy Nova that Claire had been seen getting into the night she disappeared. The name had slipped through the cracks in the early days of the case, overshadowed by the many other potential suspects. But now, the DNA had circled back to the Whitman family. The connection felt like a thunderclap in the middle of a quiet room. Mia's heart raced. There it was, the link she had been hoping for. The answer, buried in the past, finally beginning to come into focus. The screen showed the Whitman family tree, branching out across Essex County, and Mia could already see the implications forming in her mind. David Whitman, his father, his family. The connection was real. But how far did it go? Mia felt her pulse quicken. The missing piece had finally surfaced, but this was only the beginning. She couldn't stop now. Too much was at stake. She grabbed her phone and dialed her father, her fingers trembling. "Dad, it's Mia," she said, her voice low, almost breathless. "We've got something. I think we're finally close." As she spoke, her mind raced through the possibilities. The truth had been there all along, buried in the DNA, hidden in a letter never sent. And now, with the Whitman name resurfacing, she knew the pieces were finally starting to fall into place. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at the screen again. The name Whitman had appeared, but it only opened up more questions. What did the Whitman family know? And how much had been buried in the years that followed? there was still so much left to uncover. And now, with one family's name at the center, the investigation was far from over. The lab was bathed in the sterile glow of fluorescent lights as Mia Keller stared at the glowing screen in front of her. The raw data seemed almost too surreal to comprehend. For months, she had chased down every lead, every bit of evidence, only to find that each new clue led to more dead ends. But now, finally, the past was reaching out, pulling her forward, unraveling the tightly wound fabric of a case that had haunted Rockport for decades. Mia's fingers hovered over the keyboard, a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. The DNA sample taken from the letter addressed to Claire Donovan's mother had led to a name, David Whitman. A respected pastor in Rockport, a man with a flawless reputation, and the son of Samuel Whitman, the man who had once owned the blue Chevy Nova. Claire was seen getting into the night she disappeared. The Whitman name had always been in the background of the investigation. Too many connections, too many people, each one a dead end. David had been considered, but dismissed. A community leader, a man of faith. But now, it seemed, his bloodline carried the weight of secrets that had been buried for far too long. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she traced the genetic lineage through the Whitman family tree on her screen. There, in the thick branches of familial connections, lay the answer she had been desperately searching for. But just as Mia leaned in closer, her gaze fell on something else. On the side of the screen was a photo of David Whitman in his church, standing in front of the pulpit during a service. The black and white photo was blurry, but there was something there, something familiar. The angle of the shot, something about the shadows and the way the light hit his hands made her stomach tighten. Then, she saw it, the tag. A small, worn key tag, barely visible, hanging from David Whitman's keychain. It was faint, but unmistakable. The same tag she had seen in the recovered North Star key from Claire's purse, the one with the faded engraving. The tag was still attached to a ring that David Whitman, of all people, had kept all these years. The same tag that had appeared in the records of Claire's disappearance, now staring back at her from the past. The North Star key, a symbol Claire had written about, a key that might have been her final attempt at leaving a clue. It was too much to ignore. A chill ran through Mia's veins. She leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. The discovery felt monumental, but she had to be certain. She called over the forensic imaging technician, Seth, who had been working on refining evidence from the 1973 case. "Seth, check this," Mia said, pointing to the photo of Whitman and the key tag. "Does that look like the key tag recovered from Claire's purse?" Seth peered over her shoulder, squinting at the photo. He nodded slowly. "That's it. Same tag, same wear pattern. It's got to be the same one." Mia's mind raced. There was no way this could be a coincidence. But why would a man like David Whitman, who had spent his life behind a pulpit, guiding the town with kindness and faith, be connected to the key that tied him directly to Claire's disappearance? Was it just a random key tag, or was there something deeper at play? Just then, Seth's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mia, I've got something you need to see." He was holding up a set of forensic imaging scans on his tablet. Mia's pulse quickened as she saw what Seth had uncovered, a fingerprint from the back of the key tag, previously missed in earlier examinations. The print had been cleaned up using new imaging software, allowing for greater clarity. Seth tapped the screen, enlarging the print. Mia felt her stomach drop. The fingerprint matched a 1990 shoplifting report, a report filed under David Whitman's name. She stared at the screen, the revelation hitting her like a freight train. David Whitman, the upstanding pastor, the man who had sat in front of his congregation for years, had a criminal record. A shoplifting incident from 1990, one that had never seemed to connect to Claire's case, one that had been buried beneath the weight of time and forgotten leads. Mia's head spun. How had this piece of the puzzle slipped through the cracks all these years? How had no one noticed the connections between Claire's key, the fingerprint, and the man at the center of the investigation? The same David Whitman who had been dismissed for his perfect alibi, his unshakable reputation. But now, everything was coming apart. She leaned back in her chair, trying to steady her breathing. The past was merging with the present, unraveling the layers of history that had kept this case cold for so long. The pieces were falling into place, too quickly, too sharply. but there was still something nagging at her. One more thing that hadn't been uncovered. Mia stood up, grabbing the file and rifling through it. She stopped when she saw the 1973 payphone report, the one that had always felt incomplete. The call Claire had made just before she vanished. There had always been something off about it. Something about the tone, the urgency. She had thought it was a male voice. But now, with everything falling into place, Mia knew something wasn't right. Mia's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the audio restoration files from the payphone call. The crackling static filled the room as the sound waves came to life. Each hiss and pop a fragment of a memory long buried. The technician cleared his throat, his voice tense. "Listen closely, Mia." Mia's eyes widened as the audio was cleaned, revealing the truth. The voice wasn't male. It wasn't a stranger's voice at all. It was Claire's. The recording came through clearly now. "Check the marsh before sunrise." Claire's voice, trembling, desperate, was unmistakable. Claire hadn't just left behind clues. She had made a final call, her voice shaking through the static, guiding them toward the truth. And now, the investigation was no longer about finding the culprit. It was about unraveling a web that had been carefully hidden for decades. The sun had barely begun to break through the mist as Mia Keller drove down the winding streets of Rockport, her hands gripping the steering wheel with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She had been here before, as a child, visiting her father, Tom Keller, who had spent countless hours walking the streets of this quiet town, chasing a case that never seemed to end. Now, it was her turn to unravel the story her father had never finished. Rockport had always been a picturesque town. Its salt-worn buildings and rugged coastline made it a favorite destination for tourists. But to Mia, it had always felt like a place frozen in time. Everyone knew everyone, and secrets were the currency that kept the town's heart beating. This was the town that had loved David Whitman, and it was this same town that would watch Mia now, with a polite curiosity, as she conducted her investigation into the man they had all admired. Mia parked her car in front of St. Luke's Church, the stone building looming like a monument to tradition. The steady rhythm of the bell tower echoed in the distance, a constant reminder of the town's unwavering faith in its leaders. David Whitman, the beloved pastor, had been a fixture in the town for years. He had led services, hosted fundraisers, and even helped families during the darkest moments of their lives. No one had ever suspected that the man at the pulpit might be hiding a secret far darker than anyone could imagine. She stepped out of the car and walked toward the church. The doors were open, the interior bathed in the soft light of early morning. As she entered, David Whitman was seated in the front pew, his back to her. He was a tall man, with salt and pepper hair and a face that had aged like the very stone walls of the church. When he turned to face her, his expression was warm, inviting, just as it had always been in the years of his public service. "Detective Keller," he said, his voice smooth, almost too polished. "It's been a long time." "Yes, Pastor Whitman," Mia replied, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I'm sure you're aware of why I'm here." "Of course," he said, standing and offering her a seat. "You're investigating Claire Donovan's case. It's such a tragedy. A young woman with such promise." He paused, his gaze momentarily distant, before he returned to his usual calm demeanor. A loss to the town, indeed. Mia sat down across from him, taking a deep breath before speaking. "You were the last person to see Claire. Her body was found near the marsh where you grew up, and now, we've traced her key to you." At the mention of the North Star key, Whitman's hands trembled, just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough to send a chill down Mia's spine. He quickly clasped his hands together in his lap, his fingers rigid. Mia watched him closely. He was good at maintaining composure, but there was something in the way he reacted to the key, something that told her he knew more than he was letting on. "Claire was a kind soul," Whitman said, his voice low. "I remember her well. She attended services with her mother when they first moved to town. I can't imagine what happened that night." His gaze softened, as if lost in a memory. "She had such promise. We were all devastated." Mia wasn't fooled. "But you don't remember anything unusual about the night she disappeared?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Whitman shifted in his seat, his hands now clasped even tighter. I remember hearing about it in the news, of course. But that night, I was here at the church, preparing for the Sunday service. I couldn't have seen her that night. Mia made a mental note of his alibi. It didn't add up, but she needed more. There were pieces to this story that were still missing. As she left the church and drove around the town, the quiet streets held an eerie stillness. It was as if everyone knew something but was too afraid to speak. Mia's next step was to reach out to people who might know more. Witnesses who had seen Claire on the night she disappeared, before she was last seen getting into that blue Chevy Nova. It wasn't long before Mia found a woman who had worked as a waitress at Mariner's Diner during the summer of 1973. Eleanor was now in her late 60s, retired, and living in a modest house on the edge of town. She invited Mia in, offering her a cup of tea. When Mia mentioned Claire's name, Eleanor's face tightened. "I remember that night like it was yesterday," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was closing up the diner when Claire came in, just before her shift ended. She was in a hurry, looked agitated, like she'd been arguing with someone." "Who?" Mia asked, leaning in. "Do you know who she was arguing with?" Eleanor hesitated before speaking again. "She didn't say much, but I did hear her mention something about a church volunteer. It wasn't a name, but the description fit. She was talking to someone near the door, someone I didn't recognize. I didn't see their face clearly, but they wore a cross around their neck." Eleanor paused. "I'm not sure, but I think it was Elaine Whitman, David's mother." Mia felt her breath catch in her throat. Elaine Whitman, the mother of the man she had just interviewed, had been near Claire that night? Was she involved? The connection was chilling. The pressure was building, each new piece revealing something darker beneath the surface. Later that evening, as Mia sat in her car, going over her notes, her phone buzzed with a message from the lab. Her heart skipped. The lab had confirmed it. David Whitman's DNA was found on the envelope seal of the letter that had never been mailed. The letter Mia had found hidden in the case file. Mia's grip tightened on her phone as the realization hit. The evidence was stacking up. The past was catching up with David Whitman, and the town was starting to show cracks in its perfect facade. What had really happened that night? And why had David Whitman's DNA turned up in a case he had spent years hiding from? The answers were just beyond her reach, but they were finally within grasp. If you're enjoying the twists and turns in this investigation, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the next shocking reveal. The interrogation room hummed with the steady buzz of the overhead lights, casting harsh shadows on the walls. Mia Keller sat across from David Whitman, who had been invited to the station for what they called a clarification. He looked every bit the part of the reverent, respected community leader, dressed in a navy blazer, his posture straight and composed, his face a mask of serene calm. To the untrained eye, he seemed just as he had always been, the kind pastor, the pillar of Rockport. Mia leaned forward, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, a thick folder in front of her. The room was silent except for the rhythmic tapping of a pen as she flipped through the pages of the file. "I'm sure you're aware of why you're here, Pastor Whitman," she began, her voice steady, yet carrying the weight of everything she had uncovered. "We've been investigating the disappearance of Claire Donovan, and the evidence, it's pointing to you." Whitman's eyes flicked briefly to the file, but his expression remained unchanged. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "I've counseled hundreds of people in this town over the years. You can't expect me to remember one lost girl." Mia's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze not leaving his. "You're right," she said, her voice low. "But we have something you can't dismiss. We've got DNA evidence, a fingerprint, and a timeline that links you directly to Claire." A long silence filled the room as Whitman's calm exterior remained unbroken. He shifted in his seat, but his eyes remained fixed on Mia, unblinking. His fingers twitched slightly, betraying a hint of unease, but he said nothing. Mia slid a Polaroid photo across the table, letting it slide toward Whitman. The image showed Claire Donovan, smiling and carefree, with her wild curls falling around her shoulders. The picture was taken months before her disappearance, but to Mia, it was a haunting reminder of what had been lost. "She called us," Mia said quietly. "Before you killed her." Whitman's eyes flickered down to the photo. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Mia's pulse quickened as she saw the slightest crack in his composure. just enough to make her believe she was getting closer to the truth. "She called us," Mia repeated, her voice soft but firm. "She called from a payphone, David. She said to check the marsh before sunrise." Her final words were North Star, as if she knew something we didn't. As if she knew it was you. For a moment, the room felt colder. Whitman's expression faltered for the briefest of seconds, the calm mask cracking just enough for Mia to see the flicker of something behind his eyes. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But the weight of the words, the weight of the accusation, was too much. Mia pressed on, not giving him the chance to regain his composure. "You were the last person to see her alive. You owned the car she got into. You knew her. You were part of her life. And now, we have evidence that ties you directly to her death." The silence in the room grew thick, suffocating. Whitman remained still, his fingers now clenched tightly on the armrest of his chair. The tension was palpable, the sound of his shallow breathing the only noise in the room. Then it happened. The shift. The moment the mask fell. Whitman's voice broke the silence, but it wasn't the calm, composed tone he had used throughout the conversation. It was shaky, cracked. I didn't mean for it to happen," he whispered, his hands trembling as he lowered them to his lap. His voice caught in his throat as he continued. She was just so difficult. She wouldn't let go. I tried to make her see." Mia's breath caught in her throat. The first real sign of guilt. The first crack in the perfect facade. "You tried to make her see?" Mia asked, leaning forward, her voice tightening with controlled urgency. What? What was she supposed to see, David?" Whitman's hands clenched into fists. His eyes darted around the room, avoiding Mia's gaze. "I didn't want it to happen. I never wanted her to know. It wasn't supposed to go that far." Mia's heart raced as she watched him unravel. For the first time, David Whitman was no longer the calm, respected pastor. He was a man backed into a corner, revealing pieces of his dark secret, one fragment at a time. "I tried to help her," Whitman continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. "But she wouldn't leave it alone. She kept asking questions about my family, about Elaine. She knew, and she wouldn't stop." Mia's eyes narrowed. "Elaine? What does your mother have to do with this?" Whitman's face went pale. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I didn't want it to end this way." Mia's stomach churned as the pieces began to come together. Elaine Whitman, his mother, the same woman who had been in the diner the night Claire disappeared. The same woman who had seemed to vanish from the investigation. It all clicked. Claire had been digging into the Whitman family, asking the wrong questions, and now she had paid the price. Mia felt a chill sweep over her. "You killed her," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. David Whitman's shoulders slumped. His head dropped, and for the first time, he allowed himself to break. The truth, long buried beneath layers of deceit, had finally surfaced. As Mia processed the moment, a new, chilling detail broke through the haze of her thoughts. The payphone call Claire had made, her voice, trembling, guiding them toward the marsh, wasn't just a final plea for help. Claire hadn't just been calling for rescue. She had been naming her killer. The words North Star had not just been a clue. They had been Claire's way of pointing to David Whitman, her final effort to guide the police to the truth before it was too late. And now, as David Whitman sat across from her, broken and exposed, the case that had haunted Rockport for over 50 years was finally beginning to close. But Mia knew the hardest part was still ahead. How deep did the Whitman family's secrets go? The arrest of David Whitman sent shockwaves through Rockport. What had once been a quiet, picturesque town, where the most alarming event was a misplaced fishing rod or a missing cat, now felt like a place steeped in secrets, betrayal, and grief. News vans flooded Main Street, their satellite dishes a stark contrast against the quaint, unassuming buildings that had lined the street for generations. People gathered in small clusters, whispering, shaking their heads, and wiping tears from their eyes. The parishioners of St. Luke's Church, devastated by the revelation that their pastor, the man who had guided them through their darkest moments, was now revealed to be a murderer, were filmed on camera, their sorrow raw and palpable. But even as the town tried to reconcile the man they had trusted with the horrifying truth of his actions, Mia Keller felt the weight of something larger than just one man's guilt. The case wasn't over yet. There was still more to uncover. pieces of the past that had been buried for far too long. On a cool morning, Mia and her father, Tom Keller, stood at the edge of the old marsh where Claire Donovan had vanished all those years ago. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the fog rolled in off the water like a veil hiding the secrets beneath. Mia had visited this place before, with her father, as a child. But now, the meaning of this place was different. The marsh, once a symbol of the town's quiet beauty, had become a silent witness to a terrible crime. Evidence crews were already at work, digging through the silt and debris, the faint crunch of their shovels breaking the stillness. Each new shovelful of dirt they removed brought them closer to the truth, closer to the pieces of Claire's life that had been swallowed by time. Mia watched as a small, glinting object emerged from the mud, a fragment of clothing, tattered and stained. The team carefully sifted through the dirt, and another piece was unearthed, a bracelet, silver and worn, with a tiny lighthouse charm. Mia's breath caught in her throat. She recognized it immediately. The charm was identical to one seen in old photos of Elaine Whitman, the woman who had been David Whitman's mother, the woman who had always seemed so distant from the investigation. But now, the charm told a different story. It told a story of complicity, of a mother who had been involved in a secret that had been buried beneath the surface, just like the bracelet now glinting in the morning light. Mia's mind raced as she thought back to the small details that had been uncovered. Elaine Whitman had been with Claire the night she vanished. Witnesses had seen them near the marsh, but no one had questioned her involvement. David Whitman's mother had always been a shadow, a figure standing just behind the curtain, never fully revealed. But now, the truth was unfolding piece by piece, and Mia knew it wasn't just David who had been responsible for Claire's death. Mia's eyes narrowed as she pieced everything together. Elaine Whitman, the mother of the man who had killed Claire, had played an active role in the cover-up. She had been seen with Claire that night, just before her disappearance. Witnesses recalled a brief, heated argument near the marsh, something about a church donation scandal. Claire had been digging into the financial discrepancies at the church, asking too many questions. She had been uncovering things that David, and likely Elaine, had hoped would remain hidden. Elaine, in her desperation to protect her son's reputation, had taken Claire to the marsh after the confrontation. What had started as a warning had quickly escalated into something darker, and the consequence had been Claire's life. As the discovery settled in, Mia's throat tightened with emotion. The final pieces of the puzzle had clicked into place, but the horror of the truth was overwhelming. The town had been held captive by a lie for decades. The story of a good, kind pastor had been shattered, but what was more devastating was the realization that Elaine Whitman, the woman who had been regarded as the town's matriarch, had helped her son cover up the murder of an innocent girl. And for what? To preserve a legacy? To protect a man who was no longer deserving of that protection? Mia turned away from the marsh for a moment, trying to steady her breath. She couldn't help but think of Claire's family, of the mother who had passed away without ever knowing the truth, without ever finding closure. Justice had been delayed, but now it was finally coming. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the message. It was from the lab technician who had been working on Claire's case. "Mia, we found something in the old file. Claire's last letter. It's dated the night she disappeared. It was never mailed, but it was found in the Donovan family's things. You need to read this." Mia's heart clenched as she read the words Claire had written, the same words that had haunted her from the moment she'd first learned of Claire's disappearance. The letter was brief, but its meaning was unmistakable. "If you ever find this, it means I didn't make it home, but I tried to leave you a light." Mia sat down on a nearby rock, the weight of Claire's final message heavy in her hands. Claire had known. She had known what was coming, and she had tried to leave a trace behind, a signal that would guide them to the truth. Claire's final words were not just a plea for help. They were a declaration that she would not be forgotten. Mia stood, looking at the marsh once more, the weight of Claire's words echoing in her mind. Justice had been delayed, but it had never disappeared. And now, finally, Claire's light had pierced through the darkness. The truth was no longer buried beneath the silt of time. It had been uncovered, piece by piece, until nothing was left to hide. As Mia read Claire's last letter aloud at her memorial bench, The breeze whispered through the trees, as if to say goodbye. The town of Rockport had been living with a ghost for decades, but now, at last, the spirit of Claire Donovan could rest. Justice, delayed by family silence, finally breathed. The town of Rockport was torn in two as the trial of David Whitman began. The peaceful streets that once echoed with the calls of gulls and the distant hum of the harbor now buzzed with tension. News vans lined Main Street, their satellite dishes like silent sentinels, while locals gathered in tight-knit groups, whispering in hushed tones. Some spoke of their beloved pastor, a man who had guided their community for years, and others whispered of betrayal, of trust shattered by the very man they had relied upon. Inside the Suffolk Superior Court, the atmosphere was no less charged. The prosecution painted Whitman as a man consumed by power, a respected figure who had hidden his dark secrets behind the pulpit. The evidence was damning. The DNA, the fingerprint, the bracelet, and the key, each piece building a case that could no longer be denied. Claire Donovan, the sweet, hopeful young woman who had once seen the beauty in everything, had been silenced by a man she had trusted. David Whitman sat at the defense table, his eyes sunken and tired, but his posture still upright, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The defense, however, did everything in its power to discredit the evidence. They argued that Elaine Whitman, David's late mother, had played a more significant role in Claire's death than anyone had realized. She had been the one to escort Claire to the marsh that fateful night, to lure her into a confrontation over the church's finances, a confrontation that had led to a deadly altercation. Elaine Whitman, the matriarch, had died before her son was ever questioned, and with her death, the family's secrets had been buried. The defense portrayed David as a victim of his mother's manipulations, a man who had been forced into a corner and had acted out of fear. The trial unfolded in slow, painful moments. Each day brought new revelations, each one more shocking than the last. Claire's family, once hopeful that justice would be served, sat quietly in the gallery, their eyes red from weeks of emotional exhaustion. Mia Keller, sitting in the row behind them, felt the weight of each passing minute. She had worked so hard, fought so long for answers, but it still felt like something was missing. The truth was out, but the cost of that truth was heavy. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the verdict was delivered. Guilty. The word hung in the air, its finality slicing through the room like a blade. David Whitman, the once respected pastor of St. Luke's Church, was sentenced to life imprisonment, the years stretching out in front of him like an endless corridor. His head dropped, the years of deceit and manipulation catching up with him all at once. He would never return to the town he had once ruled with kindness, never stand at the pulpit again, preaching faith and redemption. Instead, he would spend his life behind bars, a man broken by his own actions. As the gavel fell, the sound reverberated in the courtroom, and an oppressive silence swallowed the room. The air felt thick with unresolved emotions, as if the weight of 50 years of unanswered questions had finally been released, but the grief of that release still hung in the air. Tom Keller, now gray and tired, the years of working through cold cases etched into his features, sat beside his daughter, Mia, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. He watched the scene before him with quiet resignation, his face a mask of exhaustion and relief. After all these years, the case had finally reached its conclusion. The truth had been revealed, but it had come at a cost. He turned to Mia, his voice barely a whisper. 50 years, he murmured. She waited. Mia nodded, her own emotions a mix of sadness and triumph. The town had changed, and so had she. The weight of the case had never left her, but now that it was over, she couldn't help but feel the loss. They had found the truth, but at what cost? Claire Donovan had never lived to see this day, and now, her memory, her spirit, was tied to the town in a way that could never be undone. As the courtroom emptied, Mia and Tom walked outside into the fading afternoon light. The sky was painted with deep hues of crimson and purple, the sun sinking low over the water. The harbor, calm and quiet, stretched before them like a mirror, the water reflecting the soft glow of the sky. They made their way to the memorial bench where Claire's family had placed a plaque in her honor years ago. The words on the plaque were simple but powerful. Justice may be delayed, but it never disappears. Mia sat down on the bench, her fingers tracing the edges of the brass plaque. The tide lapped gently against the shore, the waves rhythmic and constant, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, life went on. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the cool breeze on her face, and thought of Claire, of the girl who had never been forgotten. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the town of Rockport settled into the quiet of the evening, the truth now laid bare. But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, out there, in the marsh where Claire had been taken, the tide still whispered her name, reminding them all that truth, no matter how buried, always resurfaces. What do you think was the hardest part of Claire's journey? Was it the fight for justice, or the people who failed to protect her? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story hit home for you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.